Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening, and good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. WeatherBrains episode number 843. We are now into springtime. This is for March the 14th, 2022. All right, pre-show time, pre-show. By the way, if you're looking for the actual produced program, move the slider up about 8 minutes and you will find it. But this is the magical time of the program where we share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and occasionally we say really, really, really outrageous things. All right, embed code is locked and loaded. Hope you had a good day. Interesting weekend here. Had a little bit of snow early Saturday morning as the weekend started. That was fun. Down here at this latitude, that doesn't happen a lot. It does, but not a lot. On this date in 1993, the low here where I am, Birmingham, Alabama was 2 degrees above zero with 13 inches of snow on the ground after the famous blizzard of 93. And also, March is always interesting. Every day in March, you've got these really interesting anniversaries. It was on this date in 2008 that the tornado went through downtown Atlanta during the SEC basketball tournament, the men's basketball tournament. And nobody said a word in the Georgia Dome. The tornado warning was issued a good 30 minutes before it got there. Nobody said a word. Nobody did anything. And Alabama's playing Mississippi State. Mikhail Riley for Alabama hit this wild last-second three-pointer to send the game into overtime, which probably saved a lot of lives. If the game would have ended, people have been walking back to their hotels on the street during an EF2 tornado in downtown Atlanta. But the game went to OT, and the rafters were shaking, and the roof was coming and going up there. And but what was really weird with that deal, I got a call. I had been out to a local youth baseball park throwing some batting practice to our son, who was 11 at the time or 10. And I just walked back in this room and my phone rang, and it was Tom Stipe. Tom is the executive producer of the Alabama Sports Networks. And he said, "Nobody's saying a word here. There's panic. We don't know what's going on. We think it's weather related. Can you help us?" And so I did wall-to-wall weather on the University of Alabama basketball network for 15 minutes. And it was kind of picked up by the TV guys, Tim Brando and Joe Dean Jr. But, I'll say this for the Southeastern Conference. They have literally gone from worst to first when it comes to severe weather preparedness and doing the right thing. They're really good now, but they were not good in 2008. All right, so let's see if we can stir up anybody to come on the show here tonight. I know we got some folks that are out. I think Jen is out. Let's see here. I don't know if Bill's going to make it this week or not. I think Troy is out. Let's see. I think Aubrey is out. Be sure I got everybody here, and I think I do. So here we go, and they will be joining us here in just a second. Yeah, but that deal was just surreal. One person was killed by that EF2 in Atlanta, and it just could have been horrific. But nobody knew anything. The players, the coaches, the fans, they didn't know, and unless they had a portable weather radio. But the iPhone was less than 1 year old in 2008, or maybe about 1 year old. And most people didn't have smartphones and the apps, and we didn't have wireless emergency alerts, and just a very interesting case study of how to do it, how not to do severe weather. But yeah, in fact, I'll make that my pick of the week, the actual telecast. What's fascinating, there was rain fade, and the signal went away because of the satellite attenuation of the satellite signal from the uplink truck to the satellite, and all the local stations had to go to a slide or a graphic for a few minutes, or maybe a few seconds. Wasn't that long, but then it came back, and you could tell that there was a twinge of panic in the some of the folks that were in the upper deck, and you can imagine being in the upper deck of the Georgia Dome when this thing was coming through there. And but again, it was just absolutely surreal. And again, I was watching it, looking at the radar, and I was doing, wall to wall weather on the sports network. It was just a very interesting night. So, but that was on this date in 2008. Neil, you ever been to an SEC basketball game before?
I have, yeah.
This was the anniversary of the EF2 tornado in downtown Atlanta during the SEC basketball tournament. And that was a total debacle.
I remember.
In terms of, that nobody in the building knew anything. Coaches, players, fans, nobody. They didn't say a word. And this, again, the iPhone was about a year old, and, smartphones, very few people had them. And even, I don't think we had the good push technology to push warnings. I don't think wireless emergency alerts were active at that point, and just nobody knew. And so, but if Mikhail Riley did not hit that 3-point shot that sent the game into overtime, thousands and thousands would have been walking the streets from the Georgia Dome back to their hotel in downtown Atlanta, and the death toll just could have been horrific. So, one of those interesting evenings in the weather office here. Oh, yeah. We got the legend on tonight. I'm excited. Bill, can you hear us all right?
Yeah, I'm afraid I heard that last remark. And so all of a sudden, this has gone from a happy time to pressure.
No. This is going to be a great show. I cannot
I'm
wait.
really looking forward to it, James. Thanks for having me.
No, this is going to be good. Neil and Kim are going to be kind to you. I can tell. They're going to be in a good mood.
They've never been any other way. So if there's some different way tonight, it'll be a real departure from the last 20 years.
All right. So we have to wait until the top of the hour to get started. So we'll start in 1 minute. That's when we're on the local TV, and we're live on YouTube for the world, and we're on local television in this market. And then the audio version, most people listen to this. It's released late tonight after midnight. So that's the sequence of events here. Is Bill Murray, Neil or Kim, have y'all heard from Bill at all this week?
I haven't heard from Bill Murray. I thought he was supposed to be here for this, and I know Rick should be because he just submitted a pick of the week. So the only people I know that are out are Jen, Aubrey, and Troy.
Yeah, but Bill has been absent a lot. They must have extended the 50-cent beer night at Hooters for one more week. So hopefully we'll get him back next week if he's not here. And again, we got 15 seconds and we're going to get this thing started.
Let's be honest, James, it would be complicated with two Bills. I think it's okay if we do just one Bill.
I was thinking maybe Bill has a better memory than James does. And he remembers the last time I was on, he decided this was a clear miss.
No. This is going to be a great show. This is going to be a legendary show. And welcome to our television viewers. Glad you are here with us. And let's get the audio channels recording. And we will get this thing started. Neil, you're going to introduce Bill. Are you the official introducer guy here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome. This is going to be good. All right, here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
WeatherBrains is brought to you by Midland Weather Radio. Every home, school, and business should have a NOAA Weather Radio, the official voice of the National Weather Service. And the AMS Weather Band.
Join the American Meteorological Society by becoming a member of the band. The AMS Weather Band is a global community of weather enthusiasts dedicated to learning and sharing their love of science. Visit amsweatherband.org to learn more and join the band today.
Hey. Weather Brains, episode number 843, the weekly show all about weather, longest running weather podcast in the universe. 16 years and we're still here. I'm excited. Going to be a great show tonight. Good to see Rick Smith from Oklahoma. So have y'all got any hailers out there, Rick, or is that all down in Texas? I glanced at the radar a few minutes ago.
It's about 30, 40 minutes down the interstate from us, not too far. I-35, about halfway between Oklahoma City and the river there. And then there's actually been a couple of tornado warnings down in north central Texas, but nothing here. I mean, the hail can stay south of here.
Kim is our other Norman, Oklahoma correspondent. I would assume that you're happy that hail is not falling in your neighborhood this evening, Kim.
You know, every day that we get to keep our recently repaired roof is another great day. And I know living here, it's just a matter of time, but we really hope we can beat out that clock, you know, the replacement clock for paying off the roof and having the extra amount you paid for the class for shingle, you know, to really withstand the impact of hail. You just want to outlive that. So I think that timeline is something like 4 years. If we can do that, then the investment will pay itself off. Living in Oklahoma, it is always rolling the dice. But today is not our day. Today is not our day.
Last year, you wouldn't have made it 4 months, much less 4 years. I mean,
yeah, we're just going to see if this spring can be kinder to us. What we're actually kind of worried about right now is fire. That's our bigger, more pressing risk here in central Oklahoma. When I came back from field work last week, you could clearly see the boundary of where there's been moisture, and then you get into Oklahoma and there hasn't been moisture. And it is extremely obvious. The roadsides are just dotted with all of these dead cedar trees or dormant cedar trees that are this perfect wildfire fuel. And everything is just kind of brown, and it's that horrible feeling that we get here of any random car can throw something off and ignite wherever. And it's just one of those things. It has happened in the city limits of Norman in the past, and we're in sort of that same bucket again. So as much as I don't appreciate hail, honestly, I'd prefer precipitation of most any type to that. It's just, pick your battles.
Droughts and wildfires are the absolute worst. I just droughts, heat waves, wildfires. It's at the bottom of my list. So no, I don't like it. And by the way, before we let Neil introduce our very special guest this evening, let me just say that we've got some out tonight. We've got Aubrey and Troy and Jen. They are out, although Jen did send a This Week in Tornado History. Bill Murray is out. I think Bill might be joining us next week, but let's bring in Dr. Jacobs. Neil, bring in our special guest. This is going to be a great, great show.
I am just incredibly proud and humbled to call this man my friend. We've got Dr. Bill Hooke on tonight. He's the recent emeritus senior policy fellow at AMS, 21 years there, founder of the policy program, AMS executive director, 30 years at NOAA, deputy and also acting chief scientist at NOAA while he was there, and lots of work in risk communication. I know Kim's excited to ask you some questions on that. AAAS fellow. In fact, he's a fellow of all sorts of things. I could go on for another hour. I do want to talk about some of his degrees, but he's got a blog called Living on the Real World and a book by the same name, which I am proud to say I've read twice, and I have a signed copy. So thank you for that. I don't know where I first met you. I think it was at a Washington forum.
That sounds right, Neil. And I can't remember when we first met either, but I do remember that you were teaching me. You were taking me to school from the very beginning. You had a lot of ideas about the private sector and how it worked with the public sector. You had a lot of ideas about numerical weather modeling and how that should be done and so on. And I just remember thinking, where has this guy been the first, 60 years of my life or whatever? And my life has been turbocharged since I met you. I could probably say similar things about Kim and other fields of endeavor like social science. So anyway, and I'll just mention something. Your group is called the WeatherBrains, and I was feeling prepared for this because today I got my copy of AARP, and in addition to having Halle Berry on the cover, it's got an article entitled "How to Survive Dangerous Weather." And I thought, man, I'm ready for these folks. But in the first 5 minutes, you mentioned two weather hazards they didn't even cover, and that was hail and drought. So they got tornadoes, they got floods, they got, a couple of other things. But, man, what a group you have here. And it's a privilege to be here.
There's so much that I want to ask you, and I definitely want to dig into the weather enterprise and public-private partnerships. But But take me back to the beginning. So I was a physics major as an undergrad, as were you.
Yeah.
How did you switch from being an undergrad in physics to getting into weather and climate?
Okay, so I remember that pretty vividly. So I was a physics major at a small liberal arts college in Philadelphia, and they didn't have any meteorology course, and I wasn't particularly thinking about meteorology. I liked fooling with electronics, and I used to repair TVs and radios and so on for the people in my neighborhood, and that was the kind of thing I did. I thought I was going to be an electrical engineer or maybe a solid state physicist. And the University of Chicago at that time was having trouble filling their graduate student pool in physics because they had such a reputation nationally, which I didn't realize, for being nasty to their students and being really tough to get through the program. But they recruited me and I showed up there. I did 1 year in physics and it was kind of dog eat dog. The problems were all overworked and there were too many people in the field. It was very competitive. But there was this line in my 9th grade science book that began with weather. That was what we were studying in 9th grade. And it said, scientists are a community of scholars engaged in a common search for knowledge. And I thought, that's not what's happening here. This is, a cockfight. And so I looked around. I had a friend who was in mathematical biology, and he was studying the fluid flow in blood vessels, but they didn't have anybody to teach that. And there was this professor from geophysical sciences who was teaching, a guy named George Plotzman. He said, you should talk with him. So I did. And Plotzman said, it was an easier, gentler time. This was 1965. And he said, well, we got 2 people who could support you. There was an ionospheric physicist by the name of Colin Hines, and there was a cloud microphysicist by the name of Roscoe Braham, which I think is probably a familiar name to you all. And I didn't know either of those names, but I thought clouds are something I see all the time. That sounds really interesting. And about a week later, this guy Plotzman comes back and he says, well, it turns out Braham doesn't have any money after all. So I developed an instant love for ionospheric physics. And that's how I made my switch. And it was like walking into the sunshine because there were more than enough problems to go around. Nobody was getting rich. Nobody was, stepping in each other's way or anything like that. It was cooperative. It was fun. There were human beings in the department. And I actually finished. My whole graduate experience only took 3 years. So I did 1 year in physics and I did a year in geophysical sciences. And then I'd done my qualifying exams and I was just presenting to my advisor a progress report on my thesis. And he said, well, it looks like you've broken the back of the problem and I'm going back to the University of Toronto next fall. So why don't you try to finish up this spring semester? So I went a whole semester without sleep and got done.
Wow.
Kind of was the wow factor. My dad got his PhD in math from Princeton in 3 years. And the whole time my brother and I were growing up, my mom said, your dad got his thesis in 3 years, but you'll never be able to do that because you've got my genes mixed with his, she said, and I'm not as smart as your dad. But both my brother and I got our PhDs in 3 years. He got his in operations research from Cornell. And again, it was an easier time. We had problems that were kind of overripe for solution and so then I went to work for what was to become NOAA. It was called the Environmental Science Services Administration out of Boulder. Yeah. So that was a little bit more than you asked for, but you get.
Well, I was going to ask about that. So you've worked at least 2 different cooperative institutes, or that's what NOAA calls them now. One in Boulder, I guess at CU, and then up at CSU. What were you doing there?
Yeah, well, very little. Both those were sort of part-time jobs. I was really working for labs, NOAA labs. So I started out in a lab called the Ionospheric Telecommunications Lab. And in 1970, when Nixon set up EPA and NOAA, that lab went off to become part of something in the Department of Commerce called the National Telecommunications Information Agency, NTIA. And Neil, you might remember that on some org chart from your days running NOAA.
Oh, I met with them on a daily basis when we were arguing with the FCC over spectrum interference.
Spectrum, yeah. That's the kind of thing they did. And they cared about ionospheric radio propagation then, and I knew something about that. But there was a remote sensing lab that was also part of NOAA. They were just getting started. And they had all these great remote sensors, but they didn't know what they were looking at. And I had been studying atmospheric waves, and I said, oh, you're looking at internal gravity waves. And I came over there, and it was just a great sandbox. They had all these instruments that were seeing these strange things, and nobody had seen them before because nobody had acoustic sounders and these ground-based radiometers and so on. And it was a lot of fun. And for the Joint Institutes, they were just getting cranked up. And they kind of asked me to be a fellow of both of those institutes. And, mainly what I did was kind of recruit real talent, like people like Susan Avery and Franco Einaudi. And, my biggest accomplishment, I'll fast forward to a story with John Knaus when he was head of NOAA and I was deputy chief scientist. He had this room full of all the AAs and stuff. And he said, your main job is to get somebody to fill your job who's smarter than you are. And I looked at him and I said, for some of us, that's going to be easier than others. And my main job was getting smart people hooked up with tough problems and enthusiastic about it.
That's awesome. So what brought you from Colorado to the DC area?
Yeah, okay, great question. And so just so you know, you're asking questions. My career is I've never gotten a job I applied for, and I never turned down a job I was offered. And so what happened to me was I got interested in this thing. In 1978, there was this new thing called the Senior Executive Service. And by that time, I was a manager. I mean, one of the best things that can happen to a mediocre scientist, is they put you in a management position. And mediocre scientists are the best in management positions. If you put a superstar there, he or she, can't relate to the average performer. But if you put a bench warmer into one of those jobs, they see all kinds of average performers around them and they know how to get the most out of them. So I was lucky enough to get a management job. That's another whole story. But I was looking for an SES job. I thought science meets society. That's what I want to do. And I applied for a bunch of jobs, mostly heading research labs, not only in NOAA, but some other agencies. And I would always finish like in the top 2 or 3, but never get the job. I was kind of a utility infielder. And I was kind of their second best person. But they always had somebody who was better at the discipline than I was, and they'd give that person the job. So then one day, they had a head of NOAA. A new head of NOAA had come in, and I won't mention his name. He's dead now, so I'm feeling free to talk about this. But he was really toxic. He had come in from another agency, and around him, mistakes were fatal. And he wasn't much of a scientist, and they thought, well, we need a chief scientist position. So they tried to fill that for a few years, and Congress was obstreperous and so on. And they said, well, we need a career grunt to get in there and hold things together when we're between politicians. And so they said, we'll create a deputy chief scientist position. And nobody wanted it. They came out to Boulder and they put their arm around me and they said, why don't you apply for this position? And I had survived a briefing for this guy once. He was, really ready to dig into me. And I was pushing something called the STORM program at that time. science and technology, storm scale operations and research meteorology or something. And I said, this program is so important that it's carved in stone in the Commerce headquarters building, the Hoover building. It says, Commerce, braves every tempest, invades every zone. And he looked at me and he said, where does it say that? And I said, over entrance number 10. And, he looked at me and my whole career passed before my eyes, but he decided I was okay. And so they held this position, this SES position. They opened it up for 2 weeks, if you could imagine that. And then they closed it. There were only 2 people who applied. And they gave me the job. And between the time I took the job and got back to Washington, this head of NOAA had moved on. He was a protege of a Secretary of Commerce by the name of Malcolm Baldridge. Baldridge was not only a big industrial guy, but he was a rodeo rider. He did calf roping, and his horse had fallen on him and ruptured his intestines, and he died. And this administrator of NOAA decided it was time to move on. So then everybody came out of the woodwork and said, didn't we tell you we were interested in the deputy chief scientist job? And HR, bless them, said, well, you should have applied before the deadline. So that's how I got to Washington.
That's awesome. Wow. I had no idea about that story. So was your position in the Hoover building?
Yes. And, there was a chief scientist. They finally got a chief scientist by the name of Mel Peterson, who had worked at Scripps. He was a protege of Roger Revell's. Mel had run the deep sea drilling project, and he and I had our first day together. We were both rookies, and everybody in D.C. ate from our rice bowl for about 1.5 years, something. Well, we were trying to figure out how D.C. worked. It was pretty embarrassing.
It's an interesting town. It's speaking of figuring out. Yeah. Oh, I've learned the hard way.
Well, you learned the hard way, but you accomplished a lot. I can't say enough about how much I admire what you were able to do with the EPIC program and just kind of giving NOAA a sense that, hey, a real card-carrying scientist was in charge, and even if he didn't know your field, he was going to find out about it and be a good listener and so on. And you did amazing things.
Thanks.
It was different in my case.
I learned so much. It was unbelievable. I feel like that span of time compressed like 12 PhDs worth of information. It was just nonstop learning. I mean, I out of all the different government agencies, I think NOAA probably has the most diverse mission of anything I've ever seen. But so you come to DC, you're learning how the town works. What sort of was the genesis of this policy program with AMS? I've always thought that this is such an amazing opportunity because our field is, granted it's a lot of scientists, but there's this big gap between what most scientists do and actually how the policy works. And I feel like it's only the people who've really gone through this program or been in DC for a while who've experienced that firsthand are actually sort of understand how the science gets translated to policy and back and forth. I don't really see a lot of that in other fields. I really feel like AMS has a unique thing here. What was the genesis of that? What was the story behind starting that?
Well, I'm looking at a couple of people from Oklahoma, and Oklahoma played a pivotal part. There was a guy named Jeff Kemple who was, a dean there and the provost there and so on. And he teamed up with some other people in AMS, Dick Hallgren, who had been head of the National Weather Service back in the 70s and 80s. With a fellow named Robert White, who had been the first administrator of NOAA. He was a head administrator of ESSA back in the 60s when I started working there, and first administrator of NOAA. the three of them, a guy named Dick Greenfield, who worked at NSF, they all kind of sat around and said, we don't have any leaders in meteorology anymore. There was a whole class of people who came out of World War II who learned meteorology during the war, and they were, on aircraft carriers and, Army bases, Air Corps bases and so on. And they were the leaders for the first 20 or 30 years, but they never dealt with succession planning. And we need to get a new generation of leaders going. And one day they called me in and they said, you need to get this started. We don't know what it's going to be, but you're going to call it the AMS Summer Policy Colloquium. And it was built on the NCAR Summer Colloquiums, that were famous for doing technical subjects for the previous quarter century. I mean, they're still going on. And they said, but we want it to be a focus on policy. And the whole time in my federal career, I've been taking these short courses for managers in policy, in management of science, rather, the Federal Executive Institute in Charlottesville and the executive seminar centers in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Denver, and so on. And I took all those I could get. And, what I remembered was the best part of it was hearing from practitioners about what they did and why they did it. And it was just so inspiring. I mean, you find all of these high-minded people in these government positions and related private sector and so on. And I thought, man, I could just listen to, and somehow we're going to get these folks together with a small group of folks. And it was trial and error, mainly. We did it for 20 years, and it was probably, just as experimental the last couple of years, as particularly with COVID and trying to do it virtually, as it was the first couple.
I remember
we wanted to fill a gap. And Kelvin Drogemeyer was in the second group. He was in the 2002.
Really?
Oh yeah, he was in the 2002
that.
group. He was a faculty member. He and Fred Carr came from Oklahoma, invested in that program. They've always, Norman community, whether public, private, academic sectors, they've always sent a couple of people a year to that. And it shows. When we started that program, you could list a half dozen university departments in meteorology that were kind of on a level playing field. But today, Oklahoma is the big one. And I think a lot of it was that they aren't just expert at meteorology. They're not just dealing with a whole bunch of big problems that happen in their backyard, but they're very savvy about, how to make the policy process work, not just at the federal level, but the state level. When Kelvin came into the president's science advisor job, I was trying to tell everybody, look, he came from the state that produced Senator Inhofe and Scott Pruitt and stuff. They've been dealing with these guys since day one. He's vaccinated. He knows how to do this. And sure enough, he did.
I was just talking to both Kelvin and Fred in the last couple of days on some issues. So yeah, they're still great resources. I remember when I first heard about the policy program, because my PhD advisor, Gary Lackman, went to it. Yeah. So what's next for the policy program? Like where do you think they're going to go from here?
Well, I'm not going anywhere from here. Paul Higgins is going to do it. And my guess is he's going to reimagine it. And I had just last year, I renewed the NSF support for this program with one of the program managers at NSF. And I was telling him when I said I was retiring that I wanted to hand this grant over to Paul Higgins. And he said something about the risks associated with that. I said, yeah, there is a very real risk that it'll be a lot better than it was during the 20 years that I did it. So I'm thinking that, Ken was in the real thing is you get good people coming to the program. And a lot of them were skeptical about investing 10 days in it. And a lot of the leaders, the people like you who've come in and talked, the people from the Hill who come in and speak to the group, they're skeptical at first, but they meet the group and it's so lively and exciting that they all it's tough sell the first year, and then they're happy to keep coming back. And our motto is to all these bright people, we only slow you down for 10 days. They're all going to amount to something. They're all going to amount to something despite our best efforts. Anyway,
it's an awesome program. I mean, that I enjoy so much being able to talk to people about policy and how things are done in DC. But so I'm going to skip ahead here in a second and pick your brain on public-private partnerships. So I'm going to hand it over to Kim here because she's got some more related questions to this.
Yeah, before you get to those things, I kind of want to go through a little bit of another historical arc of developments in our field that you've been involved with. Really quickly, I will say, though, having participated in the policy colloquium at the end of my master's, it was right when I was starting my PhD, it changed the course of my, whole future from that point forward. I tackled, a policy relevant question for my dissertation. And I learned that something existed, the AAAS fellowships, that at the time AMS was a sponsor of one of them. And, later that was how I got to DC for the couple of years that I was there. So it was absolutely transformative. And I was so grateful that you took me in and that you made such a wonderful program. But I do want to come to an arc of another kind of story that also was influential in my young career and had already been at work in my young career at that same time. And this was your involvement in cultivating the social science in meteorology, because it had been recognized that physical science alone wasn't going to address the wicked problems that you are so interested in. You write about, that your interest from the very beginning, as you've described it, was the interface of science with society, and you wanted to do something in there, and you recognized that there needed to be this growth. Tell us about that. What were those early efforts like? What were you involved in to help get that spun up?
Well, before I start, I got to say that you had some very kind words there, but the transformative thing was the transformation you worked, both from your Hill platform and then going back to NOAA as a contractor and so on, and continuing right up in a whole bunch of different roles to the present day, you and others, and it's been a tough slog to get the social science into the picture, to be as disciplined about the social science as we are about the meteorology. And, I did the same thing it's the same as the story of my marriage. So I'm married to a wonderful person named Chris. And the whole story of our marriage is Chris has a good idea, drags Bill. And so, we started this policy program because other people had said, Bill, you go do that. And one of the first people we had was a bright person by the name of Janine Fisher. And I think maybe Kim and Neil both know her. I'm not sure she's as well known as the next person I'm going to mention, but Janine showed up with a PhD from the University of Michigan in atmospheric and space science, and a master's degree in public policy that she got from a guy named Homer Neal, who had been, the director of the National Science Foundation before going back to the University of Michigan, where she was a student. And she was one who kept, reminding me that there was this discipline called policy. And if you knew a little bit of it, Bill, you would see that you have to do this, that, and the other thing. And by the way, Bill, we should really have an AMS journal on policy and things of that sort. And then the second force of nature that showed up was a person that I think all of you know by the name of Gina Esco. And Gina was there for about 5 minutes, and she said, well, policy is great, but what really matters is societal impacts. Just all of this was mind blowing. I had hair before they started interacting with me, and then the explosion just caused it all to leave the room. So somehow just listening to you all, and there was an event in the 80s that really made a difference to me, and this was before I met you all. So it was a year before I came to DC, actually. And this is another story that has an Oklahoma connection to it. Frank Press, who was the head of the National Academy of Sciences at that time, was a seismologist. And he thought what the United Nations needed was an international decade of natural disaster reduction. And he had one kind of abortive attempt trying to get that going, and it didn't work. And he set up another committee, and it was supposed to have a meteorologist on it by the name of Joe Golden. And it makes a lot of sense, right? The guy who sets up the Tornado Intercept Project, it's just the perfect kind of person to be on this. And for some reason, Joe couldn't do it or didn't want to do it or whatever. And so they asked me, would I do it? When your name is Bill, you're involved with a lot of Plan B. And so anyway, I get to DC for this first meeting, and I walk into this room, and I'm thinking at this time, I'm going to be good at this. Hurricanes cause natural disasters. That's one of the things I study. And I get into this room, and I realize I don't know anybody in this room. And then I realized that they started introducing themselves because it's the first day, and they're engineers, and they're social scientists, and maybe there's one earth scientist. And I realized I am their token meteorologist. And they start out saying things like, of course, nature doesn't cause disasters, people do. Oh man, I was so glad that in one of those rare moments, I kept my mouth shut during the first hour or two of this meeting, because I really, by the time I left that 2 or 3 days, it changed everything. Up until that time, I thought, man, I'm doing this atmospheric science. It's great. I'm really helping the world and so on. And then I realized, no, there's this whole other piece to this that has to be done. And I started paying a lot more attention to what social scientists were saying. And so I had been pretty worked over by the time Janine and Gina and people like Kim had shown up and so on. But that's a long answer, Kim, but that's the idea.
So it was a wonderful answer. Thank you. And I'll hand you back now to Neil. I know he really is excited to talk a little bit more about the Weather Enterprise, but I might piggyback off of that later to bring this conversation back around also to the social science, as you've continued to be involved from that angle and actually thinking about the whole enterprise as well.
Yeah, I'll just mention quickly before leaving that one of the last things I was privileged to do in there was an Academy report that I co-chaired with Ann Bostrom, who's in risk communication, currently up at the University of Washington, but she had also been at NSF as a program manager and so on. And it was a real privilege working with her. We came out with a report called, dealt with integrating social and behavioral sciences into the weather enterprise. And we kind of thought, Neil, one of the big things in this was there ought to be a voice, a perspective of social semancists at the leadership levels in NOAA. And we were singularly unsuccessful in making that happen. We had people like you, Neil, who because of your private sector experience more than anything else, you understood that in spades, but it wasn't something that was really integrated into the heart and soul of people. And we're still looking forward to that happy day.
It's a challenge. And I think people are starting to realize that, especially with all the talk over the last few years about science communication and everything else. And so I'm going to come back to that with respect to social media and some other things. But before that, I wanted to, I guess, maybe segue into a different report when you've heard me talk a lot about, and that's the Fair Weather Report.
Oh, yeah.
So, the public-private academic partnerships, weather, water, climate enterprise, this is something that we've talked a great deal about. What are your thoughts on the Fair Weather Report, then and maybe now. And I guess maybe let me highlight one aspect that they actually called out AMS as being a neutral host.
And that was an unusual thing for the Academy to do. I mean, normally they don't mention specific institutional names. And it's very important to understand that what they said was AMS would be a great venue for holding public-private partnership conversations. They didn't say AMS should be an arbiter. They said AMS is good at renting a hall, and let them rent a hall, serve donuts or something, and get the public and private sector talking. And I think the great thing about the Fair Weather Report, it doesn't mention the word marriage ever, but it strikes me that there's a marriage analogy there too. If you're married or you have a spouse or a significant other, or even dealing with family members, you learn sort of right away that it should be less about bright boundaries. Your responsibility is this and their responsibility is that, and more about unity and community and, relationships. And, the Fair Weather Report did a great job of that. And the early start to the enterprise did a great job of that. But as you and I have discussed, it spent too much time on making nice with each other and not enough focus on, hey, there's some pretty urgent world problems that require that we make nice with each other. Let's get to solving those problems. I think that it's been a little tougher to make progress in that area. We still have a long way to go. And you, with EPIC, you're getting off to the right kind of start with that. And also, I think going back to, the broadcasters are just so important to this, public connection. James has been kind of a silent partner in this discussion all along. I'm sure that wasn't true during the first 842 episodes, but right. But the thing is that's just a priceless kind of connection to science and just the field where the 8 billion people of the world really need it now, with resilience to hazards and climate change and environmental problems and all the rest of it. So we really are at a place where we can make a difference. But that public-private partnership, there wasn't enough emphasis on it's a partnership to serve a third party, and that third party is this wider public that is in desperate need of help and not particularly able to afford to pay very much for it, and also kind of preoccupied with other things like jobs and wars and pandemics and things of that kind. So there's still a lot of work to be done in the partnership, but the Fair Weather Report was just a huge step in getting the Weather Service to wake up to the fact that it's not all about just putting rules out there for a private sector that is about to just blow by them in terms of innovation and potential and size and application and everything else.
The amount of money that I've seen invested in private industry is astronomical compared to what the public sector has for this. And I mean, you could argue all day that when you look at the financial impacts globally of weather and climate, they're huge numbers. And I've never seen a market sector with such great disparity between how much is financially at risk and how much is invested to mitigate it. But, that's why I think that the public-private partnership aspect of this is so critical. Do you think the Fair Weather Report, is that something that there's a lot of it that's sort of written that it's almost timeless, but I feel like it was written from a context of back when private industry was largely just using and repackaging output. Right. Is that something that we should revisit as enterprise, or?
Yeah, it would probably be great to revisit it in a kind of rolling way. You know, the way DoD has these 5-year rolling budgets and things of that kind. If you could do something, because things are evolving so rapidly in terms of the need and in terms of the capabilities, in terms of what social science has to offer at different points and things, and just the whole international aspect of it is changing rapidly as well. And so absolutely.
When you're talking to folks in the policy program, how much do you dig into sort of the financial aspect of this when it comes to policy?
Not enough. So, we got a small grant from NOAA to do some work on valuation. And we had an actual expert on valuation, namely Jeff Lazo, who I think you know, used to work at NCAR and has retired, but has still done a lot of work for WMO and others. And, he had a very special person by the name of Molly McCauley, who used to be at Resources for the Future, and we wanted to do a lot more in this area. And then she had the most kind of tragic, unfortunate death, and that project kind of never really got going in quite the way it should. But economists, physicists and meteorologists can be happy-go-lucky. Oh, we'll study something because it's interesting. Economists don't study it unless they see that they can make a living at it. And so we've got to put a little more support in the hands of the economists to get them to look at the problems seriously. And we haven't really invested, of all the social sciences, there's quite a difference between that one and some of the other social sciences, but we haven't really invested in quite the way we should have there.
So speaking of resources for the future, I've listened to a lot of the stuff they put out, and I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on this? Why are people so reluctant to openly discuss uncertainty when it comes to climate change?
Oh, you're going to have to ask, our social scientists on your WeatherBrains staff here. Kim, what do you think?
I was just going to put into chat, welcome to your defense, Bill. You started out with this thing, oh, yes, Neil and Kim are going to be so gentle on me. And there are guests who come on every so often and feel a little bit like it's a defense. So if you're feeling that way, just know that's normal and you're going to get through this.
I'm not feeling that way, but I'm feeling like, I'm not sure I have anything really constructive to add to that particular question.
It's a tough question. Neil's good at asking really tough questions. That's one of his giftings.
People we're all terrible with uncertainties, right? You all have made a big study out of it. There's this bias that we have that we're all lucky, and then there's other biases that we're all risk averse. And, we make a hash as individuals of, putting investments where the risks really are in our lives. So don't expect me to be any better than average.
Yeah, I don't know if, Neil, you want to recast the question. I think it's an interesting.
Maybe you want to answer it a little bit, Neil. Maybe you've got.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I don't have an answer for it. That's why I was asking you. I guess maybe I think people want to project confidence in what they do know, and discussing things that they don't know or that they're not confident in is like, I mean, would you go into a doctor's office and panic if the doctor said, I don't know what you have? That part of that is, I think it's, to me, at least, when someone admits what they don't know, builds confidence in my mind when they tell me these are the things that I do know, because I'd say, okay, because I know that person is is willing to admit things that they don't know. Now I trust them when they do admit or do say, these are the things that I do know. But people who just shy away from discussing this stuff, I don't think that builds confidence the way a lot of people think it does. That part makes me nervous. The other part is as researchers and scientists, we need to study the stuff we don't know. If it's stuff that we know, that's great. I'm more interested in the things we don't know.
Well, somehow we have a reputation in our field of being very good at talking about or living with uncertainties in the weather. You know, there are all these horrible jokes about meteorologists as a field, and, you know, how it's the only field where you can make a living when you're only right 50% of the time and all that kind of stuff. I've hated those the whole time I've been growing up. In fact, most of the time when I meet strangers and they ask me what they do, I say, well, you may have noticed that sometimes your weather forecast is wrong. And then I got a second to kind of, usually they break out laughing at that point, which is a little disturbing, but I kind of press on and I say, well, my job was to try to make weather forecasts better for, 20 years or whatever. And most of them think about it and, they think, yeah, they are better. And then you have a little basis to go on, but, so we're comfortable with some kinds of uncertainty, but when it comes to climate change, it's, certain predictions, not so much. You've got this one. I keep thinking about Kevin Claisel and being responsible for emptying that football stadium in Oklahoma if there's a lightning threat or a tornado threat or something. And I was involved in one of those at a Clemson, South Carolina game. My brother and I were, he's from South Carolina. We were watching the game. It was a South Carolina, North Carolina, UNC game. And our cousin from Chapel Hill came down. And so the three of us were watching the game, and we had to evacuate the stadium, but that's a tough call. And that's a microcosm of the climate change call. And, so there were real impacts. Of course, USC was way ahead of UNC by that time. So.
That's where I did my undergrad. But if I was outside of the state, I'd tell people I went to USC and they thought I meant Southern California. So then I would say, no, Carolina. And they were like, UNC? So that basically had to spell it out.
Yeah, you really did. Yeah, you have to kind of be from that area. Oh, but we digress a little bit. I've tried to run from your question. And so let's go back to it. I liked Kim's answer, which is, focus more on what you do know and the implications of what you do know for what needs to be done. This is where broadcast meteorologists, I think, have a lot of practice day to day. And that stuff, the rest of us can kind of pontificate about it, but standing in front of a camera and looking into all those screens at home, James, I got to tell this story. So one time I was at an OAR retreat in D.C. I was still working in Boulder when this retreat happened, and we were in the D.C. area here, and there was a forecast for 12 inches of snow the next 24 hours. And one of the local forecasters came on that night, and we were all we're thinking to ourselves, we're going to get stuck here in D.C., not get home and all the rest of it. This broadcaster came on and he said, there's not going to be a foot of snow in the next 24 hours. If there's a foot of snow, I'll leave town. And so 14 inches of snow and 24 hours later, we had nothing to do but kind of gather around the TV. And the meteorologist looks out at the camera and he says, I tried to leave town, but the trains weren't running.
Yeah. Communicating uncertainty is just it's an acquired skill. I'll put it that way.
It's a thankless job.
Yeah.
It's
brutal now, Bill. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. So I came online in 1979, and here we are these years later. You get occasional, nasty little letter from somebody that didn't like you. Now with the phones, within seconds, they are all over you. I mean, all over you. It is, I've heard cuss words I've never heard in my life, and I thought I've heard all of them. And so that's part of what we have to deal with. But then again, we have to understand, we need to listen. I do think there's some constructive criticism in there that we really need that. And so you have to separate the trolls and the haters from those that are giving you constructive criticism. So what I try and do, I try and hang out where real people are. And I do think, and I'm chasing a rabbit here, that to some degree, the weather enterprise has disconnected with the people that we serve. I'm a practitioner. I'm on a different level than everybody here. I'm the practitioner that's the last phase between the science and the people. And I just wonder sometimes if we sit around the AMS, meetings and the NWA meetings, and we decide to do what's best for us, and we've forgotten about the people that we serve. That's why I hang out, Bill, in Dollar General. You ever been to a Dollar General?
Yes, sir.
That's where the people are that we serve. And I talk with them, and they'll tell you things. And so, and again, it goes back to this interdisciplinary approach with social science. And I'm so thankful for Kim and everybody there. But anyway, I think we have come a long way, but we've still got a ways to go. We've clearly got a ways to go on messaging and relating to the people that we serve.
I want to chase this rabbit a little bit further, actually. So talking about the social media and everything that's out there today, and maybe this is just me becoming more cynical. I can't tell from my frame of reference, but has things like cancel culture, has that stifling honest debate about scientific topics? And does social media and the internet, is that enable that type of behavior, or has it always been around and this is just an outlet to sort of transmit things faster, basically?
So I'm not sure this is responsive, but I read a great book one time that NSF put out about 20 years ago. They were talking about technology assessment. And they said, if you're buried in an emerging technology like social media, it's very tough to see where it's going to take you. And so what they decided they would do was they would look at some things that had happened in the past where technology was introduced and what people expected to happen and what actually happened. And this particular book that I was looking at talked about submarine cables, telegraph cables. You remember in our history books, we learned about the big spools on the ships and they were laying the cables and so on. First of all, you got to understand that those first cables were laid before Maxwell's equations. So everybody thought electricity diffused down a wire. They didn't understand anything about a wave going down a wire. And so there was nothing in the theory that said that this telegraph signal should go more than a few miles. But they feel lucky, right? They put this thing across the whole ocean and it works. But it only worked for a few weeks. And this was before the Civil War. It only worked for a few weeks before the ocean, it tries to dissolve and beat and eat, batter and eat anything in it. And the insulation failed and the cable failed. Well, it was a good thing that happened because it kept Britain from entering the Civil War on the side of the South. Britain was really interested in having the cotton. And there was this, they were trying to break up the Union was blockading things, and some British soldiers were captured by the Union, and Britain was ready to go to war with the Union to get their soldiers back. But because the cable wasn't there, it was taking weeks to get, a message back and forth to complain. And every time they got a message one way or the other, they realized, well, a couple of weeks have gone by, things might have changed. And so there was hesitancy, and they never did it. Another thing that happened was they put a telegraph that had to go under the Red Sea and a few other things so that British and India could communicate with the British Foreign Office in London. And they thought this will be a great way for London to control foreign policy. But the opposite happened. The people in the embassy in Britain, in India, they said, by controlling what news comes out in this, we can determine what the Foreign Office is going to tell us to do. And so it worked just the opposite. And this was back in, I probably read this book in 1980 or 1990 or something, before the internet, really kind of came on. But we've had examples of that kind of thing today. So, yeah, I mean, the emergent consequences of new things, it's hard to predict. That's why we have the butterfly effect. And I'll just say this, I feel very strongly that the meteorology community, we're the tribe of the butterfly. And, we're talking about problems. The butterfly wasn't very smart. It couldn't tell whether it was creating a hurricane or causing one to dissipate. But we have some idea, and if we could just hang together as our small community, we can change the world rather than letting the world change us. And that might be going back to that whole community of science scholars, common search for knowledge thing, enterprise. That's what we have a chance to do. We have a chance. And that's why I wrote Living on the Real World. I was trying to say, hey, can we do what's needed in time? And I tried to identify 4 future tools that would work, that were cheap enough and were fast enough to work in time. A basis of facts, the kind of thing that comes from the models and the observations, policies, to leverage puny intelligence to get you to do the right thing. Networking, IT, so you could have quick exchange of success and failure, and know what was working. And early career scientists. Those were my 4 things, and I'll stick by those.
See, this is why I love talking to you so much, because no matter how cynical and frustrated I can get, you always make me confident and comfortable that things are going to be awesome going forward, because, or at least pointing out that they've always been this screwed up.
See, one lesson that James already knows that scientists really have to learn, which is the most important one, is you don't want to be a scold. You don't want to be coming on every message that you have to people is shame on you, taking that extra flight. Shame on you, throwing away your plastic, blah, 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 all that stuff. You'd lose your audience in 5 minutes if you did that, right? It's got to be reality-based, but there's got to be some hope in there and some positive energy. And here's what you can do, and here's why you can do it, and here's how it ties to your family values about protecting your kids and so on.
What I feel like that, at least for me, for you being a mentor to me throughout my career, that's something in your leadership style that I really admire. How did you learn that? Was that acquired? Did you have a mentor of your own?
Yeah, I keep thinking about that. So I got one comment on mentorship, but I got another comment on leadership and so on. So I'll tell you another story. Ever hear of a guy named Pierre Mendès France?
Mm-mm.
No. Okay. So he was a political rising star in France. And he got to be head of things. And he was a hero because he got the French out of what they called French Indochina and hand that Vietnam problem over to the Americans. And they were, a little grumpy about it in some respects, but they thought, man, are we glad we're done with that? And then he decided that the problem that the French people really faced was they drank too much wine and they needed to drink more milk. And he was gone within 3 weeks. Okay, so leadership is not about getting a society to do 180. It's more like listening to people. So when I talk about hope and when I talk about, the butterfly effect and so on, none of that's original. I'm just listening. I mean, I've got to our social scientists here would tell you, if you look where good ideas come from, most of them come from social interactions. And the way you have social interactions is you practice them and you encourage them. And my wife actually helped me with this, because the five of us here, that's my idea, the ideal social group. My wife gets interested when it's about 6 times that many people. But the more people you have kind of engaged, the more ideas kind of come up, and the good ones prosper. I keep coming back to broadcasters, but I think one of the things broadcasters do is whether it's winter storm and all the electricity is going off or whatever, they've got people feeling like they're part of a team, that they're part of a community, that they're in relationship, that we're going to get through this, that we're working together. Kim.
Yeah. So I don't want to interrupt Neil's train of thought. He has great questions, but I have some of his questions, especially about the weather enterprise, which you're reflecting on now, have been what I call a little bit gentle. And, I think it's been really great that you've had a force of positivity and hope like you through some tough times in our field too, to try to get people to the point where we are trying to tackle problems on behalf of solving problems in the world. It hasn't always been as well connected as it is. There have been times where the public sector and private sector, these different entities and academic sectors have really just not gelled. And there have been some very contentious times, deeply contentious times. There have been some members of the private sector who were working to perhaps change the scope of the National Weather Service, right, through legislation. I mean, there were some really big things that have gone on. And I'd love to hear your reflection on how did you shine light into that kind of a space? Because arguably, while you said that AMS was just this place where, okay, we're good at renting the room and bringing people together, it was a tough slog through some of those things that was very active and very important. And what you're talking about here with leadership and having some hope and not just throwing things at people, I think in those situations, people do get really angry at each other. And it's hard to pull them, you've got to pull them out of that to get them to a place where they can collaborate. Would love to hear you talk about those tough times.
Well, since I'm now officially a retired person, I can remind you of that academic saying that progress occurs one retirement at a time. And I'll pick an example from Neil's field. We talked about EPIC and inviting the public in and so on. I don't know whether the names Smagorinsky and Fred Schumann mean much to the folks who are watching this podcast. They might mean something to some of us, but Joe Smagorinsky was head of the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, which was part of NOAA's research up in Princeton. And Fred Schumann was head of the National Prediction Center, or National Meteorological Center, it was called in Maryland. And they hated each other. And so Smag's idea of technology transfer, he wouldn't tell Fred and the operational people, well, here's this new thing we've discovered in the lab. He would tell the Europeans and make Fred jealous. That was the way he did it. And that contributed a great deal to getting the European Center going. And they had a good relationship with GFDL, and NMC did not. But as soon as they disappeared, as soon as Jerry Malman took over from Joe Smagorinsky and Bill Bonner took over head of the National Meteorological Center from Fred, the two of them really cooperated. And they got things back on a good track. And I think some of that has happened. I think some of the players in the private sector have mellowed a little bit. I think we've got some even worse times of argument ahead because up to now, meteorologists have been like a precocious child. you send your kid to college or whatever, and they come home with A's and B's, and you think that's really good, But when they graduate, they have to get a job and start making the world a better place. They can't just get a better grade in, physics 506 or something. They've got to really and the pressure is going to be on the earth scientists and the private sector that works with the earth scientists to solve these problems. Neil was talking about the big dollar tag here, and we talk about $4 trillion that the U.S. is going to spend on critical infrastructure in order to bring things up. The world is getting ready to spend $100 trillion. $100 trillion, that's equal to the gross domestic product of the whole world for a year. The next 20 years on electrical, energy, food, and water infrastructure. And our field is going to be the difference, the environmental intelligence that we provide will be the difference between whether you invest that $100 trillion and get a return or whether you throw it away. Going back to, and that's front end loaded. I mean, they're starting to spend the money now. So, they needed the answers yesterday. Well, I feel like I've talked your ear off, and I don't know kind of where we are in the scheme of things here. So
no, my mind was totally wandering in a different direction, wondering if you had a finite amount of financial resources, if you invested in trying to inhabit other planets or stick it out here. But that's probably a different podcast conversation.
Oh, well, you can't stop the private sector from doing, if Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk want to do that with their money, that's okay. But, I covered that, at least my own. So again, going back to my mathematician dad. So, when I was at the Boulder, the University of Colorado built a planetarium, and they put a basketball-sized sphere in front of the planetarium, and they said, this is the sun. And a few feet away, they had a BB. And they said, to scale, this is Mercury. And further away from that, and they had all the planets, and Pluto was about a quarter of a mile away on the other side of the engineering center. And then there was a little plaque that said, on this scale, the nearest star is in Harvard Yard. And I was gushing about this to my dad, my research mathematician dad, and he said, yeah, that's why astronomy is so uninteresting. And the thing is, the moon is 240,000 miles away. Mars is 40 million miles away. And, that what you want to do is take care of Earth now and increase wealth and improve the quality of life. We'll be able to go to Mars as a hobby. But if we try to spend all our money to go to Mars with the technologies we have now, we're just, literally, since we're talking about meteorology here, spitting it into the wind. It's a great goal. It's good. You got 8 billion people. Some of them can afford to think about it, but most of us need to think about a little more equity here. I think the toughest thing to work out right now is enough fairness, enough trust. So if you build that up in the 8 billion people, we can solve just about any problem. But if we try to do it by forcing solutions on them, saying this is so important, we're going to force a climate change solution on everybody, and then we'll repair relationships, we'll never get there. And so that's convinced me kind of that we have to really worry about being fair. And so I thinking about my own career, when I was a scientist, that was one thing. And when they made me a manager of scientists, they should have cut my pay in half. And when they made me a manager in D.C. versus Boulder, they should have cut it in half again, because the things that matter in D.C. were what you learned from mom and dad. It was, tell the truth, live a life of integrity, all the rest of that. And say to Jane the same thing in private that you said to her in public, say the same thing about Jane in public that you said about her in private, and all of that basic stuff.
So I'm
mom and dad. Hey there, Bruce.
I've been reading some of your blog posts recently on that on that issue. Tell me what inspired the book.
Okay, again, what inspired the book was I thought to myself, there's all the talk about climate change and building resilience to hazards and stuff. It's so pessimistic. It's like we need to do the best we can, but we're not going to win. It reminded me of all this Norse theology, the twilight of the gods and all that stuff, that somehow we were supposed to just suck it up and do the right thing, but resign ourselves. And I thought history has really worked the other way. History has always been good things have happened. What are we missing? What can you see signs of in today's world? So you don't have to invent it. You don't have to imagine it, but you see signs of things, tomorrow's tools that we can use to solve tomorrow's problems instead of yesterday's tools. You never solve tomorrow's problems with yesterday's tools. And that's where I came up with the 4 basic tools. One of them was, we used to think that climate never changed, that weather was unpredictable, and you could put as much junk into the atmosphere if you wanted and would be okay. And we didn't just make tweaks to those laws. We turned them all on their head. The atmosphere, is pretty fragile and you can pollute it pretty easily. Climate can change abruptly. Weather's a lot more predictable than we thought. So getting the facts right, that's just so valuable. That's just such a great starting point. But then you've got to apply them somehow. And that's when I got to thinking about ants. And, ants have solved the climate change problem. They've been around for 60 million years. They've seen climate do all kinds of things. They build these ant colonies that are ideal. They take in food and water. They maintain the temperature right. They get rid of waste and so on. But there's no ant you can accuse of having the big picture. One of the problems with climate change is we got 8 billion people who all got the solution to it, but they're contradictory. And what we need is 8 billion people who are a lot more humble about it, saying, I don't know the answer, but maybe if we talk in this group of 6 people, or maybe we expand that to 60 or 600 or 6,000, we'll start having some ideas that matter. And so that was the second. If you then have policy, we all drive on the right-hand side of the road. That's because we're too dumb to drive where the open side of the road is all the time and not have accidents. If we were really smart, we would just use all those lanes whenever we felt like it, but we're not that smart. So we have a policy. Let's drive on the right-hand side of the road. And that's that one. And then, we talk a lot about climate change and we say, well, if you do this for 100 years, maybe you'll be glad you did. And that's not we talked about uncertainty, that maybe, that's a long time to be in a rut. So what you'd like to do is to have when you drive, again, all you're doing is correcting your last mistake. You're either going too fast, too slow, too far to the right, too far to the left. That's all. But you don't pull off the road after 100 yards saying, I can't do this. All I'm doing is making mistakes. We just, know what to do. And what we want is this early detection of success and failure. And we want it at a lot of local areas, and then kind of enough crosstalk. We've got all these social media now. Let's use them for something worthwhile. And then the reason for focusing on early career people and locally based leaders is, that's what you need. Going back to leadership, it's not about a vision that is at odds with everybody else. It's about listening enough and seeing what people have powerful but vague concerns. And if you can give them focus, like you say, let's create EPIC. Or you say, let's have social science and then all of a sudden, all kinds of new possibilities open up. Or you say, let's have another segment on our weather show that deals with whatever, and you've got, people like Joe Whitty and others running around working with people like James and other broadcasters, and you change things. And you've got a lot of early career people who are kind of impatient. They don't, one of the things that I tried to emphasize in that book was, when you have older people making the decisions, that's not a good strategy. Because it used to be when you died in the same world you were born in, experience mattered. Now maybe wisdom matters. You get wiser as you get older, but knowing how to use Betamax recorders or whatever, or those cell phones that were like bricks or whatever, that's not too helpful these days.
Bag phones. So Bill, we wanted you on the show tonight to celebrate your career. In your mind, what is the top accomplishment in your great career that you've had?
Getting a second period of time on WeatherBrains.
That's it. I knew it. That was the answer I was looking for right there. So that's number one. What's number two?
The first one you could get because you're lucky, but if they invite you back, even if it's 2 years or whatever, I wish I could point to something that was really nifty, James, but I feel like I've been, so I'll tell you another story. So if you want to know that you're in Washington, D.C., you can find out by going into a football stadium. And if you talk to the person sitting next to you in the football stadium and you say, "What are you doing?" and they say, "I'm watching the game," you're not in Washington. But if you talk to the person next to you and say, "What are you doing?" and they say, "Well, I'm on the quarterback oversight committee," you're in Washington. And so there, you can have an inflated idea of what your accomplishments are, but I think I've had this privilege of watching exciting people. We talked about Kelvin, Neil, Kimberly, the people, I know best here in this group, and the 700 other people that have been through that program. I've worked with hundreds of scientists and hundreds of people in the private sector and neighbors and stuff. And I just feel like I've just had a life of privilege. And every once in a while, I've been able to see people who are doing great things and sometimes help out a little bit. One thing, James, I think you can relate to this. Some of the people who are doing the best things are just miserable and lonely inside. They have a real sense of how far short they're falling. Billy Graham talked about this. He sort of said one of the problems people have that's the greatest is it's not so much that they fall short of somebody else's judgment like the 10 Commandments. He said they fall short of what they know is their potential. And they're just, you can be there in people's lives and you get a chance to remind them. People, you can't flatter people, but you can remind them about deep truths about themselves that you can see, that they're kind of hoping somebody else would see, but they never dared think somebody would. And if you can show them that, other people see that in you, Fred or Jane or Pedro or whomever, and they say, "Wow, that's who I am." The accumulated effect of that. We all want that. A lot of people, in the current, young people think they all have to have mentors today. And they need to be mentors, because what you find out when you're having a cup of coffee with somebody and being encouraging to them and actually listening to them is, and giving them feedback, and you can see them start to perk up a little. It's not draining. You're actually energized by that. You could do even more of that. And so if you train yourself to be a mentor, you'll never be needy again. And that's what I tell young people, that, look around. You're already being a mentor. Just be a little more intentional about that. Look for opportunities. Do a little more of it. Get a little practice. Make a few mistakes. And it's those small things, James, that, and kind of keeping going. One of the things Neil asked me was, did you have any, experience that was a real, downer or something to try to come back from? And, I didn't have anything acute, but I had chronic periods where I kind of felt like I had a lot to contribute, but nobody was paying attention. And, but, I kept going through those, and there's a transition that occurs. You go from being a young Turk to Mr. Chips, and then things look up, and so that's kind of what it feels like now.
So, where do you see the weather enterprise in 25 years?
Yeah. Okay. So.
I'm asking you to predict the future. That's what we do
Right.
in this business.
I'll do two things. I'm not going to predict where we'll be, but I'll predict where we should be trying to go. And then I'll say a little bit about 25 years from now, how people might look back on the present day. How's that?
That's good.
So I'll talk about those two things, because I think it's very hard to, but so I think where we should go, and I gave a talk on this subject once at a summer community meeting in the AMS in Penn State. One of the ways you can tell you're over the hill is they ask you to give an after dinner talk. And so I talked about kind of a top 10 things that I thought the community should do. But one of them is I thought we should bulk up. And so by that, and this goes back to the report that Neil was talking about earlier. So, we've got this enterprise, but it's missing a few folks. It's mostly the providers of weather and climate and water information. It's not the users. And we need to be a little more Copernican about our viewpoint and a little less Ptolemaic. So instead of thinking of the science and the meteorology as central, we should think about the user as the sun and surrounded by a swarm of vendors, including one little thing labeled meteorologists. And so we should have the users inside the tent. And I mean agribusiness, and I mean, the transportation sector and the energy sector and all that. And a meeting, we should have meetings that look like, what is it, CSE, or what's the big consumer electronics thing that meets in Las Vegas?
CES.
Yeah, CES, 100,000 people, right? That's kind of what should be going on. And in this talk, I talked about mergers and acquisitions, and I thought Keith Sider was going to panic and everybody else, but I kind of said, look, here's what you want to do. Because I was present in some of the events that caused the National Weather Association to break off. So I was a token young person in the Publications Commission in the 1970s, like 1970, 71. And these operational meteorologists came in and said, we'd like a journal. And these scientists said, well, you can publish in the science journals like everybody else if you're good enough. And so they all walked. They set up the National Weather Association. So first, I'd be trying to get back together with that group. Then I think we have a lot in common with the Geological Society of America, because it's a mix of practitioners and scientists like us. I mean, you've got people who study the earth, but also petroleum engineers and people who are extracting minerals and energy and so on from. And so that's another 19,000 members. And then we'd be up to, let's see maybe 40,000, 50,000 or so members. And, the word is getting out. And when you bring the users in, that would be another big crowd. And then we might talk about merging with AGU. If we started out talking about merging with AGU, we'd just be a bunch of scientists and we'd be lost in it. But you can get up very quickly. And this community would be of a size where the decision makers of the world would say, yeah, when it comes to climate, it would be like the American Bar Association or the American Medical Association or something. And this community, if it found its voice, with the social scientists in there and the users in there and so on. That's where we should be headed. Now, that's what I think. But my guess is, if I'm forecasting what would happen, and I'm actually working to try to do this now on a sequel of the book, do sort of an ensemble forecast of possible futures, and there's a variety of them. And I'm not going to say any more about this than that, but just an ensemble of these futures. But when we get out there, because what's going to drive this is the needs of 8 billion people. Here's the way they're going to look back at this time. They're going to say, it must have been a real privilege to be James or Rick or Kimberly or anybody, because there was this real sense of manifest destiny. You knew what the problems were and you knew you were changing the world, and it must have been great, and then they're going to say in this future, whether it's the year 2100 or whatever, they're going to say, it's not like today. Today, all we have is squabbles and organizational problems and budget shortfalls and all the rest of that, but it must have been great to be alive, back then. and because they're going to say they had the instruments and the platforms and the computers to digest the information, and it occurred in a nick of time because 8 billion people were turning the planet into an ash can, and it must have been great. But they're going to forget that if you were in the age of exploration, European, the discovery that the world was primarily water, and you were a member of Columbus's crew, the grog was wheat and the bread was moldy and the hole was damp and the captain was certifiably crazy. And the guy in the bunk above you was keeping you awake because he was rambling on about this is the greatest time ever to be alive.
All right. So one more, Bill, and we were up against a time deadline here.
No,
I got to ask you
bet
this.
you are.
I got to ask you this one.
Yeah.
So what is your advice for the incoming director of the National Weather Service, whoever that happens to be? And be honest, just let it all hang out.
Well, there's being honest and there's being thoughtful. So I do want to take just a second for a question like that, since let's see.
There's a chance whoever that future person might be that they listening to this. So
yeah, no, that's a great question. I would probably say, there are a lot better people to ask for advice than me. I would, I'd probably be saying you should make a circuit of a selection of people, and I'd have a group of people from different. I'm looking at some of you, and I'm thinking of others that I would add to the conversation. But I'd be telling them something again that they already know. I wouldn't be telling them to do something that went against their basic instinct, because their instincts would be to reach out and try to get this. But I'd just be, and I'd be saying, expect it to be better and worse than anybody can tell you it'll be, and expect it to be much more high stakes than the Weather Service has been throughout its entire experience, has been throughout its entire history. I just feel that the gloves are going to come off. They're coming off now. We can see that, just like climate change people will tell you, oh, you can see the signs of climate change now in terms of earlier spring and planting season and ice melt and so on. You can see all the signs that people really want answers from our community. And if they're going to want a better answer about uncertainties than I gave Neil about half an hour ago. They're going to want to know that people. Does that make some sense, James? And I'd include your community in there. One of the best things that ever happened to me becoming an AMS staff member was I got to go to a few meetings of broadcast meteorologists. They are so much more interesting than scientific conferences. They know how to express. All of you are expressing a thought in 90 seconds, and then you're saying, you mean I have 5 minutes? And these scientists are saying 15 minutes? You mean I don't have an hour? And they haven't finished the first chain of prepositions by then, kind of. And so, I tell the Weather Service person, they should go back. If you look at the Weather Service directors and compare them with the Neil Lanes and the Bob Sheetses and, the Ken Grahams and so on of the world, the really great communicators in NOAA have been the Hurricane Center directors.
You're darn right. They're good.
They've worked with so many of you all, and there's a lot to learn. I mean, the Hurricane Center director is like the Surgeon General of Health and Human Services. I mean, it's not the top person, but it's the face of the group in many ways.
And you got to have some basic communication skill too. I mean, that's just part of it. And I think that's why Neil did such a good job with the NOAA position.
Awesome.
He's a great communicator.
And we're not through with Neil yet. Neil is going to be coming back in all sorts of roles. He's going to be coming back in roles so big, he'll say, gee, national what?
Yeah, sometimes I drive all over the road, and sometimes I want to pull off and scream that I can't do it anymore. But it's conversations with Bill that make me keep it in my lane.
That's what makes him a great leader. He makes anybody around him feel important. And
before we break here, Neil, I got to throw the same question to you. What advice would you give the incoming director of the National Weather Service? You've been down this path. You understand the situation, and the hot seat they'll be in.
Yeah, I would say if I had to give one piece of advice, surround yourself with as many people on your team as you can, and trust them, because if you're successful, they're successful, and they want you to be successful. And so that's easier said than done, especially when you got a target on your back. You're always, you got issues with congressional oversight or budgets or the press. It's your team. I mean, they've got a heck of a team, a really, really deep bench, and they're there to help you.
Awesome.
Yeah, I thought Neil was going to say that pay a lot of attention to Rick Spenrad. Because the head of NOAA is the person you want to impress. But that thing he said about listening to your people and trusting them, that you can take to the bank.
All right, so let's take a quick break. Bill, can you stick around for a few more minutes? Do you have to go? Are you good?
No, I've got lots of time, as you've probably noticed.
Awesome. I mean, great. So we're going to take a break. We're going to go to Tony Rice and his astronomy report. We're going to have Jen, and she's not on the show tonight, but she did send a This Week in Tornado History. We're going to come back and bring in Bruce Jones. We'll talk with Bruce, and we'll have picks of the week and much more coming up in minutes as WeatherBrains rolls along.
Thank you so much.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your astronomy outlook.
The March equinox arrives on Sunday, March 20th, marking the beginning of astronomical spring in the Northern Hemisphere. Equinox is Latin for equal night, which would lead you to believe that on this day, the sun would be above the horizon for exactly 12 hours and below it for another 12. Not quite. That occurs on the day of the equal lux, which is Latin for equal light. And unlike the equinox, which occurs at the same moment worldwide, or in this case, 11:33 a.m. Eastern this coming Sunday, when the sun is directly over the equator, the date of the equal lux can vary, mostly by latitude. The closer you are to the poles, the closer the equal lux is to the equinox. And it varies year to year depending on when the equinox itself falls during the day. Equilux occurs in the northern half of the United States on the 17th, 3 full days before the equinox. It happens on the 16th in the southern part, and the line dividing them runs from south of the San Francisco Bay Area across the country to southern Virginia. And that date doesn't shift again till Tuesday the 15th, or 5 full days before the solstice, until you get into South Florida and South Texas. Elsewhere in the sky, look for Venus and Mars to cozy up low in the southwestern sky before sunrise. The pair will be about 4 degrees apart throughout the week. It's your astronomy outlook. Follow me at RTP Hooke for more spacey stuff like this.
This week in tornado history, 4 tornadoes were reported in the state of Florida on March 17th, 1985. The strongest occurred early in the morning. It was given a rating of F3 and traveled a short path of 3 miles through parts of Sarasota County. The twister developed at 2 miles southwest of Venice and moved to 3 miles southeast of town. 55 houses, many well-constructed, were destroyed, and 220 other homes had minor to major damage. 65-year-old Dorothy Taravella was asleep with her husband in their camper in a parking lot when the tornado tore through. She was killed inside the camper. Her husband received a broken arm and severe cuts. 66-year-old Jacob Sanowski was killed while standing on his front porch. A total of 45 people were injured along the path. The governor at the time was Bob Graham, and he toured the damage and said it was the worst destruction he had seen in his 6 years in office. Read about this event at tornadotalk.com. Calling all weather enthusiasts. Join the American Meteorological Society by becoming a member of the band at amsweatherband.org. As an AMS Weatherband member, you'll get to go behind the scenes with the scientists of the American Meteorological Society, whose members have been at the forefront of weather, water, and climate research for over 100 years. You'll learn about the very latest research from the scientists who are actually doing it. What's more, you'll become a part of a passionate online community of weather enthusiasts. Get access to exclusive videos, webinars, and other fun content, and support the science you love. Learn more and join the band today at amsweatherband.org.
Thank you, Jen. And Jen will be back with us next week. We'll do a double email segment next week. But I want to bring in our friend Bruce Jones with Midland Radio. And Bruce, we have a question, and I'm afraid if I don't ask this right up front, I will forget. So this is from a listener. Can we get Bruce to explain the difference between the 210 and the 50? Just the handle, question mark.
Oh, the crank radio and the little handheld.
Right.
Yeah, the difference is the crank. These crank radios, we've got a little pocket size, and there are several different manufacturers of these pocket size little radios like this, no crank, just batteries. But if you live in a hurricane zone, a really great radio to have is something like this that has a crank on it so you can generate your own electricity. And that way, if you have a power outage for days or weeks or whatever, you can use this crank radio to recharge your smartphone. And there are several brands of those available from different manufacturers. And I would strongly recommend that if you live in a hurricane zone, or if you live in a place that gets ice storms, like anywhere from Oak City through Tulsa, through Springfield, St. Louis, on up to Indianapolis, that kind of ice storm zone in there, and then over into the Carolinas too, have an emergency crank radio so that if you lose power for days or even weeks, you at least have some way to recharge your smartphone. Because remember, we're very, very reliant on our smartphones nowadays for everything, from a telephone book to a communication device to a clock, a radio. If that thing goes down and you lose your battery on your cell phone, you're really up the proverbial creek without the legendary paddle. So I would suggest that you invest in one of those emergency crank radios if you live in one of those zones.
Yeah, and that thing is like gold during a horrible hurricane situation or big weather disaster. But let's talk about weather radio. We've had a rash, Bruce, of these middle of the night pre-dawn tornado warnings here. And I can't tell you the urgency of everybody having a weather radio for that very purpose, because it is like a smoke detector when you're home for a tornado. And a lot of people don't understand that, but it's just crucial.
Yeah, like you, James, I started out my career in radio. And I used to tell the listeners, I said, if something happens at night, I can't reach out there and turn your radio on. I can't reach out there and turn your TV on. But if you'll get one of these weather radios, then when it goes off, tune to my station, and we'll walk you through the storm. So to me, the weather radio was always the alert device that told people to turn on TV or turn on a commercial radio station and get the information that's going to walk them through the storm. So, way back from when I started my career, I just thought it was a smart thing to do to encourage people to get these things so they wouldn't be asleep when a tornado hits. And, that's my biggest fear, is that my listeners or viewers or whatever might go to sleep tonight, not knowing that we're expecting something to come through in the middle of the night. It's scary.
And let's mention too, Bruce, this is not just for tornadoes. The other hazards you'll be toned out as well.
Yeah, we've got the IPAWS, the Integrated Public Alert Warning System, is coming online now. This is kind of, after 9/11, we were looking at ways to integrate all of our communications together. And IPAWS is really a way to allow emergency managers to more easily access the NOAA weather radio broadcast. So if you have a chemical spill out on the interstate and it's a really dangerous chemical or train derailment, nuclear power plant emergency, wildfire, any of these, what we call non-weather emergency messages, your county emergency manager is actually going to be able to access their laptop in their vehicle and send a message to National Weather Service to say, we need to issue a civil emergency message, or we need to issue a nuclear power plant warning or wildfire warning, evacuation, shelter in place. There's a whole bunch of these things. So even on a sunny day, when the weather's absolutely beautiful, a NOAA weather radio could go off with a life-saving alert.
And we have a special, you might explain, Bruce.
Indeed, we do. If you're listening, I'll spell this out for you. If you go to midlandusa.com, that's midlandusa.com, use the promo code SPAN25. SPAN25 is SPANN25. Using that promo code when you order a weather radio from midlandusa.com, you get 25% off all the weather products and accessories. So the promo code is SPANN25, SPAN25, and you're using that at midlandusa.com. And we've got a very nice website now. We put a lot of extra work into it. We even have a special page for emergency managers and a lot of good information there. And by the way, James, I thought I'd mention, I had 2,000 of these little stickers printed up, and people were like, why do you need 2,000? I've already given away 1,000 of them. It's a little NOAA weather radio sticker, but on the back, it has a QR code in support of the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act of 2021, a bipartisan bill sponsored by Stephanie Bice, a Republican from Oklahoma, and Mikey Sherrill, a Democrat from New Jersey, asking NOAA to put a little more money to running the NOAA Weather Radio Network to maintain and improve what they have right now, and to also add some modernization to it to bring it right up into the 21st century. It's the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act of 2021, better known as HR 5324, and you can go to congress.gov and find more information about it.
It's HR 5324, right?
Yes, sir. HR 5324. It is currently in front of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and Stephanie Bice is on that committee. But Republican from Oklahoma, Democrat from New Jersey. Remember, New Jersey got hit by all that severe weather last year. So,
right.
Yeah, they're seeing the value of this, but it's bipartisan, won't increase your taxes, just asking NOAA to put more money to run this service.
Now, if we get Neil and Bill to make a couple of phone calls, there's no problem here. So that's all. You got the power brokers in this show right here. So there you go.
Pick up your phone, guys.
And one more thing, we do want, Bruce, people that already have a weather radio, that are weather dweebs, that they really pay attention to be an evangelist and help us spread the word.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that, James, because, it's amazing how many people still, it's almost like NOAA weather radio. What is that? I haven't heard of that before. And, people are busy living their lives. So let's help them out. Spread the word about this and remind people that the federal government has paid for this very nice warning system, and you get your alerts direct from the National Weather Service office. There's really no faster or more direct way to get these than straight from your National Weather Service office.
Awesome. Well, again, Bruce, thank you. And as always, for your support and for being here on the show tonight. All right. So we're going to do picks of the week here in just a second. Bill, I got one question for you, though. This is chasing a funny rabbit. You mentioned in your younger days, you like to fix televisions and you were an electronic guy. My first major in college was electrical engineering. Do you have your ham radio license by any chance?
Oh, boy. I'm so jealous when you mentioned that. My parents were so concerned that I was going to interfere with the TV reception of every other family in the neighborhood. they wouldn't let me do anything other than listen.
Oh, no,
So my brother and I would
no.
give it anything to go on the air,
I got my ticket when I was 14 years old. 14 years old. And there was a
you
guy
had great parents.
down the street that was my Elmer, my mentor. And it was just, I would go into his, you call it a shack, your ham radio shack, and all these glowing tubes.
Yeah.
And he was communicating with people on the other side of the planet with a wire in his backyard. It was just the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And I wanted that so bad. And we were broke. We didn't have any money, but he gave me this old surplus equipment that I could use to get on the air, CW only. There's no sideband. It was just CW. And I got my novice license, and it started me on this incredible journey. And I just, those were some amazing times because, as I got older and got my driver's license, I was fascinated by weather, and the two kind of merged. And to this day, I still have my ham license. And if I ever retire, I really want to build a nice ham shack. But you can put a stinking dipole in your backyard, Bill, and talk with somebody on the other side of the world. To me, it's still, the magic has never gone away.
That's just such an awesome thought. My grandparents had a friend named Sam Matlock who lived in Greensboro, North Carolina, where he ran a couple of grocery stores, and he was a big ham radio operator and used to take my brother and me over to see his shack and so on. We were just in heaven during the time that we'd be over there with him. Yeah,
absolutely. All right, well, let's do picks of the week here. So we're going to do, and Bill, we're going to come back to you in a minute. We need something that is really good and exciting. So let's start with Rick Smith. Rick, let's see if you got a pick of the week for us.
Yeah, I wouldn't be where I am today without ham radio. I'm just going to throw my plug in there also. Great introduction. Got my foot in the door in the Weather Service, and still have my ham license too. My pick of the week is a very simple one, but it's another Daryl Hertzman special. And if you're familiar with NWS Chat gives the ability for media and Weather Service and EMs to communicate. And one of the best features of NWS Chat is this automated bot feature, where if you're in that office's chat room, you get every watch, warning, advisory, message that comes out. Well, my pick of the week is a link that you can go and set up all these rooms for each WFO that you're interested in and get that automated feed. You're not getting the chat that's going on, but you're getting the bulk of what goes on in NWS Chat. And it's just a great way this time of year to keep up with, interesting weather events going on, whether it's severe weather, flooding, winter, fire, whatever. Pick your WFO and go watch the stream of information come out.
Good old Daryl. He's the greatest. And again, we're going to put these the links up on weatherbrains.com in the show notes. Kim, let's turn it over to you for a pick of the week.
Well, my pick of the week, I chose one of the essays Bill has posted on his blog, and it's from a number of years ago, but the idea is one that I found compelling and been driven by ever since. He was writing about the need to have something sort of like an NTSB for disasters, where we have this, cycle of actually learning from our previous events and saying things like, this will never happen again, and meaning it. But you need to have some of the institutional support to do the in-depth analysis necessary to identify causes and then the feet held to fire to have someone who's accountable to those consequences. So I just think that's a really enlightening perspective to take, and highly recommend that. If that's your entry point to his blog, you'll notice that there are entries that go back at this point a long way. So if you've enjoyed the wisdom and the stories of Bill Hooke this evening, you'll get a whole lot of content on that blog.
There you go. And it's a good one too. All right. In my pick of the week, we're doing the show here on March the 14th. On this date in 2008, we had a tornado, an EF2 that went through downtown Atlanta. And it just happened to be during the SEC basketball tournament, the men's basketball tournament. And despite the fact that a tornado warning was issued more than 30 minutes prior to the arrival of the tornado, nobody in the Georgia Dome was told what was happening. No announcement until after it was over. and it was horrifying, absolutely horrifying. In my pick of the week, it is a link on YouTube to the actual live broadcast of that game, which was fascinating. Tim Brando and Joe Dean Jr. were doing it. I was on the Alabama Basketball Network for about 50 minutes doing weather with them, and kind of bled over into the TV coverage, but it's just fascinating. You could see the rain fade from the satellite uplink truck. The local stations had to go to an ID slide. They went back, and still nobody knew what was going on in that building. And that started the process of the Southeastern Conference, in my opinion, going from worst to first when it comes to weather preparedness. Now, Kevin might argue with me about, the Big 10 or the Big 12 or whatever, but anyway, that they have come a long way since that event in 2008 on March the 14th. But that's my pick of the week. All right, Bruce, let's go over to you for your pick this week. You always have some good ones.
All right. Well, everybody this time of year gets spring fever, but remember 134 years ago today, New England was digging out from the great blizzard of 1888. And if you'll just look at the Wikipedia article on the Great Blizzard of 1888, it gives you kind of an overview of it. But a couple of interesting notes. They had a lot of fire damage from that. When it gets cold and you got to heat the house back in that day and age, you threw some more logs on the fire. Well, if your house catches fire department can't get there. There's too much snow. And then the other thing that's interesting about this one, I think Louis Uccellini has written about it, is that it forced the city of New York City to start putting all their telephone lines and telegraph lines underground because so many of them came down during that great blizzard. So I'd say anything to do with the the Great Blizzard of 1888, and even the Wikipedia article is a pretty good one.
I was on television back then and reported on that. So yes, that I have read some stories about that. The stories are absolutely fascinating. So that is a great pick. Thank you, Bruce. All right, Neil, what's your pick of the week? Go.
My pick of the week is the AMS Summer Policy Colloquium. Go check out their website. Registration's open. It closes on April 15th. But it's a fantastic program, and urge anyone out there who hasn't gone through it to take advantage of it.
Yep. Obviously, it's a great program. All right, Dr. Hooke, we have given you moments to think about it, so let's lay it on you for the pick of the week from Dr. Bill Hooke.
Well, you mentioned a bunch of things came to mind when each of you were talking. One is that today is Pi Day. It's 3:14. Yeah, and I happened to look at my watch by accident at Pi hour. It was 3:14 in the afternoon, and I thought, wow, this is a special day. You mentioned, James, you were talking about the coverage of an event, and I remember when the Loma Prieta earthquake occurred. This was not a meteorological event, but I was watching the World Series or playoff games in Norman, Oklahoma, actually. I was down there for a meeting then, and the guy who was the hero of the news coverage was Al Michaels, who was doing the ball game, because he was used like a weather broadcaster is to talking about what's happening in front of him versus a script. And, the people at the different local stations in San Francisco didn't know, what to do. But Al Michaels had lived in San Francisco, and he could recognize where these camera shots were, and he broadcast it like he was covering play-by-play. And so, and then you mentioned, Bruce, the children's, the blizzard of 1888. There's a great book called The Children's Blizzard that talks about that and its impact on school kids, because the day started out really warm. They all went to school in short sleeves practically, even though it was something like 30 degrees or so. And so many of them were, the social tragedy and the special vulnerability of children and things. So you just triggered a whole bunch of thoughts with all the things you all were saying. And I really appreciated the material on the NOAA Weather Radio, which I think is just one of the great legacy stories of our community. And it has so much to offer today in very real ways. So that's nothing original, but I just kind of building off the things that, of course, the Summer Policy Colloquium, I gotta, And how you picked up that blog post, Tim, I have no idea. I'll just mention one thing. Have you ever had in your 842 sessions Kevin Petty on as a visitor? I can't tell. I think my screen froze up for a second, so I don't know whether you have or not.
I don't think so, Bill.
So Kevin Petty, you say you don't think so?
Don't think so.
Let me encourage you to think about him. And the reason is he used to work at the NTSB. He did, a little bit of a stint there. And this is tragically, he and his wife lost their home in this Marshall wildland fire up in Boulder back at the beginning of the year. And so I think they've had, a real tough time. In fact, you could have them on as a couple because she works for NOAA there in Boulder, the whatever the Global Prediction Lab is. It's the lab that's doing all the heavy lifting for EPIC out there. And so Missy Petty and Kevin Petty, you'd have a couple of hours to really remember on all sorts of things. His association with WMO and moving back and forth from InCard to the private sector and IBM. And now he's with, what is it, Spire? What company is he with right now in the open? Yeah,
it's Spire.
And just, it'd be the two of them would, or in some combination, you could figure out how you were going to do it, but they'd make a great evening.
Yeah, we'll get the guest booking officer on that. That sounds like a great show. So Bill, if somebody wanted to read your blog or get in touch with you before we wrap it up here, what's the best way to do that? Just
Well, that my information is the great thing about not being a real luminary like the rest of you are is I can put out as much information about myself as I want and nobody ever looks at it. But it's all out there. All you got to do is Google the name William Hooke or William Hooke blog, and all that stuff will pop up. And my email is on the AMS staff contacts and so on. So it's all out there.
all right. We will get some eyeballs on those products here. But Bill, thank you so much. This has been a great show. The interview was great. Thanks to everybody for participating. But thanks
for the other way around. It's such a privilege.
Well, we're glad you're here, Bill. And again, thanks to your service to the weather community for so long. But we've got to wrap this thing up. WeatherBrains typically is on the air every Monday night at 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Central. A lot of folks watch at live.bigbrainsmedia.com, but we know most of you listen. If you would like to get in touch with us, our email address, it's email@weatherbrains.com. We'll do an extra long segment next week when Jen is back. The show notes are on the website, weatherbrains.com. So on behalf of the entire WeatherBrains crew, I'm James Spann. Thanks for listening. Have a great week and God bless. Great show tonight, Bill. Thank you. Great stuff.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks for doing that.